LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Jim Hoggan, who joins us to discuss his book, I'm Right and You're an Idiot, The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up. Today we are sick of politics, weary of personal attacks taking the place of real debate, and numb to the lies of those in power because everyone's doing it. From politics to so-called entertainment, everything seems to be about conflict and confrontation. We appear addicted to negativity. It is said that we are living in a post-truth era where facts don't matter and the line between real and fake news is steadily dissolving. Infantilization and political correctness stifle critical thought and even our fundamental ability to reason. The very meaning of words has become fluid and language limited in an Orwellian pincer movement. Cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias keep us trapped in bubbles of wishful thinking, unable to face or even acknowledge the converging crises facing the world in the early part of the 21st century. We suffer from information overload, and yet millions are poorly informed. Worse still, this dumbing down looks deliberate. But if indeed it is being orchestrated, who or what is doing it, and why?
Hello and welcome, Jim, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thank you for having me.
Jim, today we're going to talk about your latest work. It's a book entitled I'm Right and You're an Idiot, The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up. Nothing if not provocative, that title, especially the main part of it. I'm guessing that's perhaps something you were going for in terms of attention grabbing.
Well, I've been in the public relations business for long enough to know that you got to get people's attention.
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay, you mentioned your career there, so just give people a little potted bio for those who are not familiar with you.
Yeah, I'm basically most of my adult life I've been a corporate public relations consultant. I specialize in an area called crisis and issues management, so I tend to be at the elbow of high-profile people and organizations when they're experiencing difficulties or get themselves in trouble on the front page of the newspaper. My background is law. I've studied law at the University of Victoria, and I owned one of the largest PR firms in Canada for about 30 years.
Okay, well, how would you sum up the book, the background, really, the situation that you're addressing? For my part, one of the first notes I made when I was reading the book was the quote, sick of politics, in that describing how people feel these days, the general populace. So, how do you characterize it? Somebody says, okay, so what's the book about? Where do you start?
Yeah, it's kind of a wide-ranging topic when you start to, when you write a book about the public square. But perhaps there's something a little bit different about my perspective than your average person's, although I think they're very similar when you talk about this kind of sick of politics attitude that we have. I see politics very closely because of my job, the business I do. So I'm involved in public issues, particularly around the environment. And when I started many years ago in public relations, my job and the job of people like me who represent every major organization, whether it's, government, departments or universities or hospitals or corporations, or NGOs for that matter, have communications advisors, people who help the organization get its message out and be better understood. And that was really the way I saw my job of public relations when I first started, that I was kind of in the message business, or helping my clients get their message out and be persuasive and clear on what it is that they were saying. I don't know when it started, but, over the past maybe, I started to notice it maybe about 15 years ago, that there was a shift in the type of communications that you saw political parties at first, and then business associations or what you could call maybe front groups for business, starting to adopt new ways of engaging on issues that really had a lot more to do with attacking people who disagreed with them, like ad hominem attacks on people who were. So in Canada, we have a lot of controversy around energy, pipelines, the tar sands. And what you've seen over the past 10 to 15 years is an attack by industry and to some degree by the NGO world on each other. And that this kind of leads to kind of an unyielding one-sidedness, this warlike approach to communications. And I think that drives a lot of this feeling of sickness and tiredness of politics, which is really unfortunate because we disengage on these issues at our peril in democracies when we're not paying attention to important public policies around the environment or around the economy or social justice issues, that we can suffer the consequences. And today I think that's what we have. There's so much pollution and so much, the public square is so full of toxic rhetoric that people just, they look at it and they think that the problems are so polarized, so highly polarized, that they just don't seem solvable anymore. And so people tend to turn away. And I think that's a big problem, and that's the reason I wrote this book.
Well, you mentioned the ad hominem attacks, and of course the very personal nature of criticism that people receive these days, attacking their character or digging up facts about their life and what have you in their affairs. By that I don't necessarily mean extramarital ones, but just generally their business, has taken the place in many cases of issues, and the issues then get sidelined, don't they? And one thing that a piece of advice I got from a friend actually who spent many years in PR when I was applying for a job and I had to give a presentation, his advice was, think about how it will make them feel. Because I told him my bullet points of what I was going to say, and he said, this is all facts. This is all stuff about, this, that, and A, B, and C, 1, 2, 3, 4. He says, go for emotion. I took the advice and I got the job. But it ran sort of counter to my instinct, which was to be very pragmatic and factual, if you see what I mean. And I think there's probably something in that speaks to the situation we're looking at now in public discourse.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, I'm a big advocate for people communicating with their whole self and to the whole selves of the people that they're communicating to. I mean, we need to, in communications, talk not just to people's heads, but to their hearts and in certain circumstances to their souls. We need to talk about values and ideas and facts and evidence, and we need to have an emotional conversation with people if we want to be understood, if we want people to actually care about what we care about. And so I'm not opposed to that. I think that's normal human communications. I think a lot of people who go to university tend to spend a bit too much time in their heads and talk to each other's heads as opposed to talking to each other's hearts. But I think we need to do more of that. More emotional dialogue is, I think, an important part of if we want to make the world a better place. we need to have these deeply emotional, values-based, moral conversations. But the problem that I was talking about earlier is the manipulation of the emotions and the manipulation of people's thinking. When the idea behind an ad hominem attack, on one level you could look at it and you could say, well, you're basically trying to persuade someone not to trust the person who's being attacked. And that's true. But there's another thing that's going on, and that is, I believe, that there are people in my industry, and you see a lot of this in the United States, but it's in different parts of the world as well, that they're not just trying to convince people that you can't trust so-and-so who wants you to be concerned about climate change. They're saying, look, everybody's biased. There isn't anybody who's objective. There isn't anyone who isn't participating in the public square on behalf of themselves. Don't get fooled into thinking that anybody really cares about the collective, or anyone is kind of selfless. Everybody's biased. And so you have this attempt to undermine public discourse altogether. And that is a sort of an invitation for unbridled power, corporate mainly, to just forge ahead in whatever way it wants to. And so I believe that these days, rather than people in the public relations business standing at the elbows of their clients and coaching them to be more convincing and more persuasive and better with their messages, that there's something else going on that basically is undermining people's confidence in public discourse, and basically trying to shut down public conversations. And that, to me, is a type of pollution that really undermines our ability to actually solve problems that are of a collective nature.
Well, two things spring to mind there. And one is, as you say, people become so cynical that they believe, to use that word, that everyone's lying, because it's what they do, sort of thing. And then if you're presenting accurate information, it becomes a case of how to gauge that, how to judge that. People are suspecting everyone's motives. It becomes very difficult to communicate effectively at all, or at least to have trust in what is being said. There's also the aspect of crying wolf with these things, and that lapses over into that overlaps with the environmental issues, which you refer to repeatedly in the book, because you have concerns there and experience there.
When I look at pollution in public discourse and the sort of the toxic state of the public square, what I think of first is this problem of ad hominem attacks like Lion Hillary or corrupt Hillary, or these sorts of personal attacks. But there's other problems kind of at play. One of them is what you might call groupish righteousness. So back in the day, when I thought that it was in public relations and communications was about convincing people, I didn't really think much about this idea that if I could actually nudge you into thinking that what we're talking about is a partisan issue, then I can actually get you to start to believe a whole bunch of things that might otherwise be very difficult for me to convince you of, just because it's something that people who are part of that team that you've decided to join believe. And so it's kind of like the tribalizing of an issue. And so in the United States, you can look at gun control. The problem with tribalizing, or you could look at climate change. You could look at immunization, and it's not something that the right just suffers from. The right and the left both have this problem. Jonathan Haidt, who's one of the people I interviewed for my book, is a moral psychologist. And he says, look, we were designed by evolution. Human beings were designed by evolution to gather together into teams, to line up in disagreement with other teams, and in that process be blinded from the truth. When we tribalize issues, open-minded thinking shuts down. And so I start to think that this is what we believe. If you don't believe this, you can't be one of us. You must be one of them. People like us don't believe those types of things. And what ends up happening is that the level of irrationality that you see in public discourse, that's a symptom of this tribalization of issues and tribalization of science, in fact, where you basically infuse evidence with a tribal meaning, a sort of a groupish righteousness kind of starts to coat the scientific information, so that when some evidence comes along that contradicts the beliefs that you have as a result of the community that you belong to, you don't change your mind. You don't convince your group to change its mind. You actually change the evidence to suit these faulty beliefs. So what happens when you have that problem is the public square just kind of breaks down. It doesn't kind of work anymore. So people just end up shouting at each other as opposed to, constructively disagreeing. So you have these ad hominem attacks. You have this tribalizing of issues and data and science. And then in addition to that, you have something that one of the people in my book, Roger Connor, called the advocacy trap. And the advocacy trap is a kind of tribalizing. So advocates, when I feel strongly about an issue, whatever the issue might be, it might be a social justice, might be a poverty issue, might be an environmental issue, and I speak out on it and somebody publicly disagrees with me. It doesn't take very long for me to start to move from thinking that they're wrong to thinking that they're a wrongdoer, and to starting to then see myself as they continue to criticize my point of view and my position, my organization's position. It doesn't take long for me to start to become highly suspicious of them, start to question their character, start to think that they're really up to something. And before you know it, it's like a battle between David and Goliath, or between a battle between good and evil. And so there is this sort of tendency that we have. People don't like being wrong in public. People don't like people assuming that they are other people accusing them of being stupid or wrong about something, or being a wrongdoer. And when you start to throw those kinds of ideas around back and forth, you start to even create more unyielding one-sidedness in public discourse. So you move even further away from the possibility of constructive disagreement. And I think those are the three sort of forces that I think about when I think about toxic public discourse. And that problem is the problem that everyone who wants to move an issue forward has, when the issue has become partisan, it's become tribalized, or it's part of a public fight.
I remember when former British Prime Minister David Cameron came to office, he promised or vowed an end to what he called yaboo politics. That was the adversarial calling of names, playground style across the British Houses of Parliament, each side facing the other, setting up kind of a conflict situation there straight away, like opposing armies. Now, that didn't last very long, this end to yaboo politics. And watching the parliamentary so-called debates, it was almost like it was impossible. You get you'll obviously be familiar with the situation in Canada and whether that's changing for the better or the worse. But it was almost like he couldn't follow through with it. You know, he'd get up there. I'm not sure how sincere he was, to be honest, but he'd get up there, try not to name call, but get called names, and then, because of his rather brittle psychological state, as I see it, would end up responding. You know, he'd been prodded so many times with a stick, and he just came back with it. And you'll occasionally get members of parliament, and others, but just sticking with this particular example, who try not to engage in this sort of adversarial, needlessly combative politics. And they're seen as somehow wishy-washy, or they don't know what they think, or they don't know their own minds, or, just, you know, they're on the fence, whatever it happens to be. And it's a strange thing to watch, really. And as mentioned before, the issues, of course, there are moved well into the background.
Yeah, I mean, I personally find it very difficult. But nevertheless, it was very interesting. I had this meeting with David Suzuki, who's a Canadian television scientist. He's basically a kind of a Carl Sagan for Canada. And he is an environmentalist and one of the most trusted and admired people in Canada. And he has this sort of, because he's such a big personality, he attracts all sorts of interesting people. And so he and I basically spent an afternoon with Thich Nhat Hanh, the famous Zen Buddhist monk, and who's also, interestingly, an environmentalist and concerned about climate change. And Thich Nhat Hanh was saying to David Suzuki that he felt that we don't need to tell the people that they're destroying the planet. They know they're destroying the planet. We should be dealing with their despair. And that one of the ways to deal with the despair is to bring meditation into any work on the environment. And so I said, well, you're not saying that environmentalists shouldn't be activists, are you? Because Canadians expect David Suzuki to be speaking up on behalf of the environment. So you're not saying that he shouldn't be an activist or other environmentalists shouldn't be activists. And he looked at me. He has this way of kind of looking into your soul almost, right? You get the feeling he knows you better than you know yourself. And he looked at me in the eye and he said, "Speak the truth, but not to punish." And at that moment, I just thought, whoa, that was such a powerful piece of advice. Speak the truth, but not to punish. That there is this need that we have, particularly because when you look at the parliamentary system, when you look at courts of law, when you look at, a sports field, when you look at business, we live in an adversarial society. We learned about the adversarial system when I went to law school. It was one of the first things you learned about. You learned why there's a defense attorney and why there's a prosecutor and why there's a separate judge and jury. It's part of this adversarial system. I think that the adversarial system stops working when you can't step out of it, when you can't speak the truth but not to punish, when you can't ever bring yourself to admit that you could be wrong, that you could be under the influence of bias, not just the other guy, right? And I think that once people start to realize that communications happens when people feel that you can listen, like human beings are incredibly aware of each other. And we know whether or not the person we're talking to is listening to us. If we believe that someone is listening to us, we are much more likely to listen to them. And that opens up communication. So this idea that we need to be able to aggressively, I think, speak up against injustice, but then be able to be receptive to somebody else's effort to speak up against injustice and be able to kind of, balance those two ways of kind of going about change is really the trick. And it is not easy. But you look at Barack Obama, I think he's a fantastic example of someone who can move back and forth between, adversarial engagement in trying to change policies and then stepping away from it and being respectful of people who disagree with him.
Well, a thought that came up there actually when you're talking about adversarial nature of society is that as much as I listen to people saying how tired they are of the sort of hollow debate that's just a lot about name calling and mudslinging, I spent a lot of my time as a pop culture critic, and I've noticed this bizarre trend in recent years of conflict creeping into the entertainment arena. And it's always been there to an extent if we think about sport, but I notice even strange things like shows that, I'm very fond of cooking, for example, but cookery shows, something that used to be the epitome of like sort of gentle television, is now turned into a battle. Everything's about battles and wars, and not just cookery shows, but lots and lots of entertainment shows are about so-and-so against this, that, or the other, and things where, in my opinion, there's no place for conflict. In a kitchen when you're just maybe cooking a bit of pasta or something, suddenly to hell with the pasta, you're a shit. And it's like, this public sort of seem to soak this up. It's almost like they crave it now, if you see what I mean. I don't know, it's almost like a drug. Like something like a heroin might be inherently bad, but if you inject someone with it a few times, they might become addicted.
Karen Armstrong I interviewed her for my book, and she said, how did she put it? She said, we must learn how to speak out against injustice, but not in a way that causes more hatred. Remember what St. Paul said, charity takes no delight in the wrongdoing of others. And you have this, I think what her view is, in 2008, she won the TED Prize. And they gave her $200,000 to do put together a project that would make the world a better place. So she gathered all of these religious leaders from around the world, from the Muslim religion, from the Jewish religion, Christian, Buddhist, and so on, and started to drafted a charter for compassion. And she told me that one of the things that she found when she gathered this group together and they started kind of looking closely at each religion was that all of these religions had one thing in common, and that was the golden rule. That this idea that you don't do things to people that you don't want them doing to you. And that this golden rule was something that was not a kind of a dusty old idea, in some big thick book like the Bible that you only thought about when you went to church. But this idea of the golden rule, was something that community leaders used to give good advice to their community in times of great danger. And so Confucius, he and his followers lived in a time of a war and conflict. And so his version of this golden rule was not some kind of old religious idea. It was basically practical advice of how to get along in the world that's a dangerous world. And so this idea of being able to kind of put yourself in the position of the other person, this idea of cultivating empathy, the way the Dalai Lama talks, this warm-heartedness, this willingness to kind of empathize with people you disagree with, is, I think, as things get worse, as they become more adversarial, in very serious ways, not just cooking shows, but, on the battlefields of Syria, or, in Washington, D.C., on the battlefield of climate change or other environmental issues like this. The need for human beings to be able to be able to be more warm-hearted and open-minded becomes more and more critical, because that's, I think, where you sort of start to move towards common ground, where we find the solution to these big problems. We don't find them, the adversarial system is good in some ways, but competition is good. But I think we also need to be really good at finding common ground.
Well, a couple of things spring to mind there. I have experience of the the conflict in Northern Ireland, just thinking about sort of well-known international conflict zones, long-running, deep-rooted, trenchant sort of dispute, is putting it too mildly. And that began to change in the 1990s. And also in the news very recently, out of Colombia, we've been hearing about the government finally making some sort of deal with the FARC rebels. I don't know how long that's been going on, but decades. I mean, and that was, a lot of people were being killed. It was like seemingly intractable. And the one thing that links the two of them is the fact that the only thing that, after all the bombs and the bullets, the only thing that moved the situation forward was people doing exactly what you described, which is talking, yes, but also listening. And I also think of another intractable international conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, which you refer to in passing in the book, and what we might learn there. And it's easy to look at something like that, actually, and say, oh, well, yeah, okay, you can cite Colombia, you can cite Northern Ireland. There's lots of examples of people, resolving these disputes, however bitter, but the sort of Arab-Israeli thing is just absolutely impossible. So it's sort of, there's a spectrum there, isn't there, about, and the starting point for me, I think, to wrap up this point, is the belief of whether something's possible or not. And I think a lot of people believe, not to focus on the Arab-Israeli thing excessively, I'm just giving it as a well-known example, but people believe, a lot of them anyway, believe that that situation cannot be solved. They just cannot envision a future other than the very black and white one that each side has in mind for themselves.
Yeah. And I guess when you start to think about that, those types of problems, climate change becomes less of, the disagreement around climate change, which I'm more familiar with, becomes less of a problem because they've been so intractable for such a long period of time. It's interesting, Adam Kahane, who was he's in my book, and he's a world famous scenario guy. He was at the time that apartheid was winding down in South Africa. He was seconded to South Africa by Shell, and he was working for Shell as a scenario planner. And he went to the government, or he was sent by Shell to South Africa to do scenario work with the various factions in South Africa, who, they're not just in disagreement, they're like killing each other or wanting to. And he basically, through scenario planning and conflict resolution, he basically helped develop a path forward that basically allowed them to avoid, decades and decades of civil unrest and violence. So things are possible. People, if you look at what Gandhi did in India, or Martin Luther King did in the South of the United States, they're these sorts of non-violent civil disobedience tools. They can actually move people out of this deep hatred for one another. I mean, but it's not easy. I mean, I just find personally, I've never been involved in anything like that. Canada is quite a peaceful place. So I've never had firsthand experience of anything like what goes on in Northern Ireland. But, I do know a lot of black people in the United States. I know people who lived in the South and have gone through those horrible times. And you see an incredible dignity in so many people in the black community where they've learned to rise above the hate so that they can start to break it apart. And, when they're so clearly the victims, you would think really, why is it that the people who aren't the perpetrators of most of the hatred are the ones who need to rise above it? But they've created incredible change in the United States by doing that. The gay community has done I think, similar things in the United States. So, I think that there is lots of evidence for it, that historic evidence that shows that these types of, this ability to kind of move beyond yourself in a way and be more interested in solving the problem than you are in demolishing your opponent, it can be a very successful way to spark change.
Well, two things spring to mind there. Yes, I definitely agree with you if it's what you're saying, that, non-reaction, on one level can be one of the most powerful things, like literally disarming in many cases. Not responding to an attack is incredibly powerful position to be in, but of course it's portrayed in the adversarial systems as a form of weakness. If you don't hit back and, crush the other guy with like 10 times as much force, then you're weak. Yeah, and of course, if you want to we were talking about religions earlier, about the golden rule, and that was one of the things, I'm not Christian, but it's one of the things I remember from learning about Jesus and the Bible, was turning the other cheek, which again can be incredibly powerful, and doesn't mean you're being walked over like a rug. I think you've alluded to that earlier about, speaking out aggressively in favor of, or against something that you believe or believe is wrong. But it's how you do that and where that comes from. And I would just tack on to the end of that, this idea, thinking about seeing the situation from other people's perspective. Leading on from that is kind of like a fear of being wrong, which which we suffer from a lot these days. Being able to actually admit, okay, I cocked up here, or I got this wrong, or even to change your mind especially when new information becomes available. A lot of people can't even do that because, again, they've come to identify with their beliefs that they hold. It becomes part of who they are. So therefore, of course, if you throw all that out, then it's quite, well, what do I believe? Who am I? And these sorts of questions start to come up. And famously, politicians and the so-called U-turn, as they call it, a U-turn is something which is very neutral, I think. You might make a U-turn in your car because you've gone in the wrong direction. You might make a U-turn in your car because you forgot something at home. But in terms of public discourse, it's, I see it now as inherently negative.
Yeah, I think it's, in a way, when I think about the speak the truth but not to punish advice, see, he's not saying get along with everybody. He is saying speak the truth, right? Say what it is, what you feel has to be said, but don't do it in a way that is, don't do it, in a manner that is seen by the person who you disagree with as sort of an aggressive act against them. That, don't do it in a mean-hearted way. Anger is not a very good strategy. I think the thing that's confusing about anger, I think, is that on one hand, anger is a great motivator, much better than fear. Fear is a kind of paralyzer as an emotion, or it can be in a big way, I think. But anger gets people off the couch and off their butts and onto the streets demanding change. So I'm not opposed to anger, but anger can also be an incredibly stupid strategy. We've all done things in anger that you will really regret moments afterwards, said things or done things. And so I think we need to be closely paying attention because, Peter Senge said to me, the quality of any intervention is determined by the inner quality of the intervener. If you are overly aggressive, if you are, filled with anger in the way you treat other people, you're going to get it back, right? And then you end up with this kind of gridlock where, and I think there may be a way out of it where you can, if you listen to people, if you're actually interested in trying to find out what it is that's driving them or they're concerned about, before you actually make, somebody who said, seek first to understand, and then to be understood, that process that you're basically, that I remember, I think that was one of the 7 habits of highly effective people in a book I read when I was a kid, a young adult, and I used that in my business, and it was very effective. I used to be this kind of person who's trying to get things done really fast. Somebody comes into my office, I make all these assumptions and be totally wrong, right? And cause more problems, right? But somebody comes into your office, they're concerned about something, you try to understand it first, and then move to the next stage, right? I think a lot of the time, that's kind of the listening lesson too, right? Trying to really get to the bottom of what it is that people are concerned about. I think a lot of the time what you end up finding out is you agree about 90% of things. And if you can reach that 90% of the common ground, then the 10% looks a lot smaller. But if you're just dealing with the 10% all the time and you never get a chance to see the 80 or 90% of common ground, then it's almost impossible because the other person looks stupid or evil.
Well, that brings to mind actually an interesting story that I read about a few years ago. And this is something that actually occurred. Now, it hasn't resolved the overall issue, which is actually that of abortion. But between the two groups that were having a dispute at the time, it was a very interesting approach. And this person doing conflict resolution was trying to look for common ground and get each to listen to the other. And they actually got to a point where they agreed on what it was that they wanted. They realized that the pro-life and the pro-abortion people, let's say pro, if you see what I mean, pro-choice, I think they call it, that they wanted the same thing. When they realized they wanted the same thing, they were going about it different ways. They still had their areas of dispute, but it was a real light bulb moment to allow them to move forward. And what they realized they both wanted was for no child to be born unwanted, if you see what I mean. And they could actually sign up to that, and it was very powerful.
Wow. Yeah, and I mean, in a way, I sort of feel like you may not even, the outcome of not being kind of highly, this sort of unyielding one-sidedness and warlike behavior, the sort of alternative to that is not always agreement. You may, in fact, an alternative may, in fact, just be the ability to constructively disagree, right? As opposed to something that just becomes like a massive energy drain on everyone. And so in a way, I think it's not just about going to common ground. It could also be just going to another kind of type of public square where you can just disagree more constructively, which is what that sounds like.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because it is a sort of a zero-sum thing. Either you can have an abortion or you can't. Either it's pro-choice or it's, pro-life, right? It is one of those things like either we're going to build a pipeline or we're not. I don't want the pipeline. I do want the pipeline, right? So when you have those types of situations, well, finding common ground may not be practical, but you can at least find, ground for, respectful, vigorous disagreement. Because I think when you have this ad hominem stuff flying around and this tribalizing and the advocacy trap, all of those things kind of polluting public discourse, you actually don't have debate. Nobody's listening to anybody. You're doing the exact opposite. And so just for the sake of the public square, trying to figure out a place where you can have vigorous disagreements. I think it's a good idea to have vigorous disagreements. That's what democracy is, right? But the idea that, ad hominem attacks are not vigorous disagreements.
Let's just address a couple of aspects of the media now, and I'm including the internet in this as well as print media, TV, radio, all the rest of it. Just the information that's out there coming to us. And there's the issue of information overload, which does factor in here, because with the internet now, 24/7, there's every shade of opinion on every issue. Everyone's a critic as well. You can get let's take for example, I don't know, the new Star Wars film. Well, you and I, we can both go and watch it, and we can go online and we can put a review up there. We're not movie reviewers. We may not even know that much about movies, but we can do it. So there's a tremendous amount of information and opinion out there. It becomes very difficult to sift through and say, who's got the track record here, who's got the reputation, whatever it happens to be. And in some ways, it's been a great leveler. I'm generally a fan, but it has added up to a lot of, as someone who's been in the media for a long time, it's added up to a strange new playing field that is level, but it's got a lot of new, interesting objects on it, shall we put it that way. And recently in the news, ironically enough, has been the issue of fake news. Particularly, I'm thinking now around the recent US election. And there was an item on the BBC the other day about people generating fake news stories. And it was in some Eastern European country, I can't remember which one, and they were talking to some of the bloggers who'd been doing these fake news stories, and their response they got from the couple of guys they interviewed was basically, we don't care, we're just doing it to make some money. And they had their new clothes, their new cars and everything else from generating stories that they knew from the outset were absolute BS. They're just literally making it up. Oh, Donald Trump, let's see, I don't know. And they're just pulling stuff out of the air. That then gets mixed in with actual stuff that Donald Trump may or may not have done or said. And this is just bizarre Orwellian type of situation, particularly now, as I say, people's critical faculties. It's very easy to look at something like Hitler found on the moon or something, and, you and I are going, yeah, what, is this the National Enquirer or whatever, but there's going to be probably someone out there going, did you hear? Hitler's found on the moon, I knew there was something up with that whole moon mission thing, and, I find people, otherwise rational, sane, sensible people who have bought into something that seems to me to be absolute patent nonsense, but because they then cite a source that's no more verifiable than you or I just saying Hitler found on moon or giving our opinion of the new Star Wars movie. We could write a review and talk about scenes that are not even in it. And somebody would be watching the film and say, oh, I must have missed that.
I guess for me, I'm a big advocate of education. I think we need to have, we need to be able to retrain and educate people. We need, in Canada, I grew up in a very poor family. I remember when I was a teen, I think I was like 16 or something, my dad telling me he'd never be able to send me to university. And he wasn't being mean. He was just, stating a fact. There was like 7 kids and he was, like a construction guy. And, but I ended up, because of the way the system in Canada works, I ended up, spending 6 years at university and getting a law degree and running, ended up starting a company where I employed 25 people and, contributed a lot to the economy and to people's lives, and did a lot of good over about 30 years owning a public relations firm. And so I'm a big advocate of public education. People don't have enough money. Make sure that we're not, you shouldn't just be able to get an education because you got money. And I also am a big advocate of trying to ensure that people actually understand how. I'm particularly interested in science and evidence and how it sort of moves through society and the influence it has on public policies. And I think the way that science makes its way through society is not through people understanding or misunderstanding the science. One of the guys I interviewed for my book his name is Dan Kahan, and he likes to use this example. He says, well, if you had 100 people in a room and you gave the 100 people a very difficult math problem, what you'd find is that of the 100 people, there'd probably be 10 or maybe 15 people who could solve the problem. What the other 85 people know how to do is find those 10 or 15 people who know how to solve the problem. And they'll come to the answer that those people have, not because those 15 people teach them math, but because they figure out that these 85 people are really good at finding out or figuring out who knows what they're talking about. So trust networks work in a specialized society by people just developing this sense of who to trust. So we choose a doctor not by studying medicine, but through trust networks, through this kind of social process that we have of identifying certain people that we become confident in. And what's happened over the last number of years with the state of public discourse is that these trust networks have been corrupted. And I think we need to treat the public square as the sacred place that it is and protect things like these trust networks and realize that we have a responsibility not just to win the day on whatever it is we're trying to do, get elected or sell something or convince people of something, but what we're trying to do, what we have a responsibility to do is to, treat the public square with, respect and with the, treat it as the sacred place that it actually is. It shouldn't just be anything goes.
One other aspect, I mentioned a couple of aspects of the media, and one other thing I've observed keenly as someone who's very interested in words and works with words is the changing kind of nature of language and a sort of reduction in vocabulary, which, we think in terms of language, so therefore, if our language becomes somehow dumbed down or meanings become changed, it affects the way we think, even our ability to reason. And this sounds very Orwellian, but, well, really it is. And I've noticed how that this has happened a lot more increasingly, particularly in the internet age. Meanings of certain words have just morphed and changed, sometimes in an organic process, but sometimes they've deliberately been changed. One of my favourite examples is the word liberal. If you think about that in the context of US politics, that's now a pejorative for many people. Oh, these, limp-wristed liberals sort of thing. Since when did liberal become a negative thing, except to, dictators or totalitarian types, if you see what I mean? So, I don't know what your feeling about that is, that say, changing language, but I think it's kind of very profound implications.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of what I'm talking about when I talk about ad hominem attacks. So, one of the examples that I use in my book is this campaign that was put together by the oil and gas industry and the conservative government that's no longer in power in Canada, the Harper government, attacking people who were protesting pipelines as they called them foreign-funded radicals. And so the campaign was this campaign that basically was advocating for something they called ethical oil. And they even said, ethical oil is like fair trade coffee or conflict-free diamonds. It costs the same, but it burns the same in your gas tank, but it's morally superior. And so there was this, ethical oil campaign. In the United States, they had a campaign called Clean Coal. But there was also this attack, where everybody who disagrees with me is a foreign-funded radical. Anybody who doesn't want the pipeline is a foreign-funded radical. And so it's a kind of silencing that you're basically stealing the voices of other people in two ways. One of them is you're saying, look, they're not legitimate. They're foreign-funded. They're radicals. So we don't listen to them. So you're silencing them. So that's, it's the misappropriation of language to steal people's democratic right to speak. And then the other one is, the ethical oil or the clean coal. That basically makes it impossible to think. Because how can you have a conversation? Someone is just, it's a silencing because you basically have taken away the ability to reason or have a conversation. So absolutely, words are important, and these propaganda techniques that are used to silence people by misappropriating language, that's classic Goebbels.
Yeah, this was Hitler's Goebbels, Joseph, director of communication for the Hitler's Nazi regime, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
Well, radical. Actually, you mentioned the word. That's a great example of what I'm talking about. Radical, again, is just something that shouldn't have any value attached to it. Something can be radically good or radically bad, but it's been turned into this thing, a bit of a radical, it's seen as, what is that really saying? It means that the person or the organization or whatever it happens to be, that they want to change something. Again, change is should be a neutral as well. But, radical is now, when I think of a radical, even in my own head, the first image I got there, someone with a Kalashnikov and, stood in, I don't know, Afghanistan or something. You see what I mean? So it definitely affects the way we all think, because sometimes our thought processes we're not necessarily fully in control of. There's the whole word association thing, isn't there? I say a word to you, green, for example. You come back with something. It may not be a really conscious process for you, but the first thing that comes up, I think, can be quite telling. Just on a point here as we begin to draw things to a close for today, I mentioned earlier about conflict in the realm of entertainment, how people seem to thrive on it on some level and almost demand it. I've written for it's now turned into more of a magazine, but it used to be a newspaper format here in the UK called Positive News. It does what it says on the tin. It's intended just to be an antidote somewhat to all the negativity in the media. Well, how can I put it this way? It's not widely distributed, it's not widely known, and I've heard people being very cynical about it, and almost find it more difficult to read than their average red top tabloid, full of disaster stories and celebrity tittle-tattle and all sorts of other negativity. And I'm just wondering, is that something that, not so much an addiction to negativity, but this sort of rejection of a good news story I find quite curious. Not that if someone hears a good news story that they necessarily want that to go away or be undone, but there's almost like a yeah, but attached to it.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting observation, and I think true. We do have this, and I think part of what it is that when everybody gets so angry, I think, you get so kind of angry, and there is a kind of there's some kind of pathology at work in social media. I don't know exactly what it is. I was just looking at Facebook last night, and I was thinking, like, God, I can't read this anymore. It's just like, I use it as like a news source, right? But it's so negative. It's like some other, Donald Trump has just appointed blah, 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 and I think, God, can I read another one of these stories? And it just ends up being such a burden, I just thought, okay, that's it. I'm not reading Facebook for a week.
Yeah, and this is not to say that you're burying your head in the sand. That's the other thing as well. I have regular spirited, shall we say, conversations with friends who immerse themselves in the sort of stories you're talking about. They then react to it, not really respond, but they kind of react to it. They'll repost it, for example, on social media, with a litany of complaints about it and just lambasting it, and often for legitimate reasons. But I say to myself, you're taking this negativity and rebroadcasting it. I know I'm starting to sound a bit zen now.
Yeah.
But I don't really mean that.
Exactly what you're talking about. I agree. That's what I was talking about, is that, and I do that, I think I overdo it because some of this stuff is so infuriating, right? But, really, do we need to go get furious? There's enough things to be furious about. We don't need to find more, right?
Yeah, I think as far as dealing with a bad situation, and this does sound rather zen, but, I shouldn't be apologizing for that, should I? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with zen? But, if you can do something about a situation, by all means act. If you genuinely can't, then accept it, if you see what I mean. And that's not about putting up with unacceptable conditions or whatever it is, or injustice or something that's absolutely intolerable, but it's kind of choose your battles and identify what can actually be done rather than just raging about something. And you said earlier about anger being a good starting point in terms of motivating people sometimes, but I think the kind of futile rage, I don't think is good for individuals or us collectively.
Yeah, it was interesting. There's a great video of Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama floating around right now, and Desmond Tutu says that he gives people kind of advice on, and he says something like how heartened he is and how good it makes him feel that so many young people that he runs into care about changing the world, making it a better place. But that what we have to remind ourselves of is that some of these big problems we can't take responsibility for them. They just are beyond anything we can do. And so you can't sort of distress yourself by taking responsibility for something that's beyond your ability to basically fix.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point really to end on, because that's not a counsel for despair, far from it. And ultimately your book is positive, and it moves into some positive territory, like, kind of what we can do about this towards the end. Just to remind everyone, the book's entitled I'm Right and You're an Idiot, The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up. That's widely available. Add anything you'd like in conclusion, and you might like to share a website with folks, just anything you'd like to put out there.
Yeah, I think come and take a look at I'm Right and You're an Idiot, the book's website. There's all sorts of resources on there and ways to connect with people that I interviewed in the book. And probably the last thing I'd like to say is right at the very end of an interview I did with the Dalai Lama, we were standing up and they were shutting the cameras off, and he reached over and tried to put his finger on my forehead, and he said, we like to think the Western mind is more sophisticated, but in Tibet we go with the heart, and I think that may be strong. I think the heart may be stronger. And so maybe if we take the Western mind and the Tibetan heart, and that together, that they can basically start to fix some of these big problems that we face.
Splendid. Well, Jim, once again, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.